Until the 18th century, the countryside in England was open. The land around a village was used for cultivation. Each villager was allocated different strips of land to cultivate. This was decided at the beginning of a year in an annual public meeting. Though these strips of land were at different places, it ensured that each villager got a balanced mix of both good and bad quality of land. Another unique quality of the English countryside was the common land that lay beyond the agricultural strips of land. This common land was open to all villagers and was used for a variety of purposes like pastures for their cows, grazing their sheep, and for collecting fuel wood, fruits and berries. However, the landscape of England changed suddenly during the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Poor peasants were no longer allowed to enter the common land and carry out their activities for their livelihood. Furthermore, even the strips of land that were allocated for cultivation were taken over by the richer landlords and surrounded by private enclosures. Let's see what exactly changed the landscape of England so drastically. In the 16th century, the price of wool shot up. This was seen by the rich landlords as an opportunity to make profits. They wanted to increase their wool production, improve their sheep breeds, and provide a better feed for them. To do this, they needed large enclosed plots of land. So they started drawing up hedges around their lands to demarcate their property from those of the others. They also drove out people who had built small cottages on the common land and prevented anyone from entering their privately enclosed land. The enclosure movement caught speed in the late 18th century, and by 1850, 6 million acres of land was enclosed. Such a drastic change was stimulated by the rapid increase in population. This was also the age of industrialization in England. The demand for food grains increased to meet the needs of the large number of people who had moved to the urban areas to work in the industries. In addition, France went to war with England around the late 18th century, disrupting the import of food grains from Europe. Taking advantage of this higher demand for food, the rich landlords started a frenzy of enclosing lands for grain cultivation to make bigger profits. They demanded enclosure acts as the early enclosures were not supported by the government or the church. Eventually, after the mid-18th century, the Parliament passed 4,000 enclosure acts. The landscape and the agriculture system of England had changed completely, bringing fortunes for the rich landlords and misery for the poor peasants. The period after the 1780s was unique in terms of the history of agriculture in England. This was the first time in England's history when the rapid population growth was being equally met by an increase in grain production. This large-scale grain production took its toll on the earlier open-field agriculture system that was being practiced in England. The open fields were covered with enclosures now. The rich landlords did everything in their power, such as slice up pasture lands, cut up forest commons, take over marshes to convert all the possible areas into agricultural fields. An increase in grain production was achieved through simple innovations as crop rotation. Clover and turnip was grown in abundance. Not only were they good fodder for the cattle, but it also made the soil very fertile. Crop rotation and enclosures were beneficial to the rich landlords and for their grain production. However, the life of the poor became more miserable. Not only were the poor driven out from the common lands, they could no longer use the common land for their daily activities, as the land now belonged to the landlords. Some areas like Midlands were more affected by the age of enclosures than their surrounding counties. In Midlands, almost the entire landscape was divided into pieces of land surrounded by enclosures. People from these areas started migrating to the southern counties of England to find work as agricultural labourers. However, they still faced the trouble of finding secure jobs. The rich landlords started the practice of hiring labourers only during the harvest season to cut costs and increase their profits. Meanwhile, the Napoleonic Wars brought further agony for the poor. During this period, the price of food grains skyrocketed. To meet the demands for food and to avoid dependence of hired labor, the landlords began buying new threshing machines available in the market. However, the introduction of threshing machines sparked riots across the country. The English landlords across the country received threatening letters signed by a mythical Captain Swing. These letters urged them to stop using the threshing machines that deprived labourers of their livelihood. Many fields were burnt and destroyed at night by the rioters. Threshing machines were also broken. The Captain Swing riots, as it was commonly known, instilled a fear amongst the rich landlords. With the end of the Napoleonic Wars, food grains from Europe started flowing in, and the grain prices fell, causing an agricultural depression to set in. The landlords were forced to reduce the area under cultivation as well as the amount of labor they used. The new age agriculture of enclosures and threshing machines brought a lot of misery to the poor and short-lived profits for the landlords. Did you know that America was also known as the breadbasket of the world? Let's see how this name came about. Towards the end of the 18th century, a major part of the USA was still covered with natural vegetation. A large portion of the country was inhabited by the Native American Indians, who depended on hunting, gathering, and fishing for a livelihood. Many of them were nomads, while a few were settled. However, things changed after the American War of Independence that was fought between 1775 and 1783. The United States of America was formed, and the white settlers were now keen to exploit the many opportunities that the USA presented to them. They were eager to turn the wild natural vegetation into cultivated fields and use timber for export. This led to a turning point in the history of agriculture in America. The government of the United States of America adopted a policy of driving out Native American Indians to pave way for the white settlers to spread across the country towards the west. By the beginning of the 18th century, the white settlers settled on the Appalachian Plateau. They moved further into the Mississippi Valley between 1820 and 1850. They changed the entire landscape and replaced the natural wilderness with cultivated fields of corn and wheat. However, it still had not achieved the title of the breadbasket of the world. This remarkable change came only after the 1860s, when the white settlers moved into the Great Plains across the Mississippi River. The Great Plains went on to become the major wheat-producing area in the future, earning the USA the title of the breadbasket of the world. The wheat production in the USA boomed to meet the growing needs of the urban population and the export market. The development of railways further supported this boom, as it became easier to transport wheat from the central Great Plains to the ports on the East Coast. Ironically, World War I also contributed to the boom, as the supply of wheat to Europe from Russia was cut off. The big farmers, or the wheat barons as they were called, took full advantage of the situation. The wheat production in the USA expanded by 65% by 1920, making USA the breadbasket of the world. Due to the Great Plains that were chiefly responsible for its wheat production, USA was once known as the breadbasket of the world. However, these Great Plains soon turned the breadbasket of the world into a dust bowl. Let's see how this happened. The Great Plains were covered with a thick layer of grass with deep roots, which was difficult to unearth with the existing equipment. To overcome this difficulty, different types of new plows were designed locally. With time, technologically advanced disc plows and tractors came up for clearing the vast stretches for wheat cultivation. Then came technology advances in crop harvesting as well. Before the 1830s, grain used to be harvested with a scythe or sickle by several men and women. In the year 1831, the first mechanical reaper was invented by Cyrus McCormick. This quickened the lengthy process of harvesting. Later, combined harvesters were invented that were used to cut grain. These were highly efficient machines that could harvest 500 acres of wheat in 2 weeks. These huge machines replaced large amounts of human labor. Many poor farmers tried to keep up by buying these machines with loans from banks. However, the Great Agrarian Depression that set in during the 1930s made matters worse. The poor farmers could no longer repay their debts to the banks or find any jobs due to the mechanization of the harvest process. The 1930s also witnessed disturbance in the ecological balance of the Great Plains. Coupled with the droughts of the 1930s and the large-scale removal of natural vegetation for wheat cultivation over the years, the Great Plains were now covered by dry soil. These huge expanses of dry soil were exposed to the ferocious winds that blew across the open landscape, causing dreadful dust storms and blizzards. People were blinded and choked. Cattle and fish suffocated to death. The Great Plains, that once was the breadbasket of the world, had now been reduced to a big dust bowl, causing damage to both life and property. In the late 18th century, the British developed a taste for tea. They imported both silk and tea from China. The British paid China in silver and gold coins for the imported tea. This began to affect the profits of the East India Company when tea became a popular drink in England. The British began to worry about their treasury getting depleted. They started searching for a commodity that they could trade with China in exchange for tea. Opium turned out to be such a commodity that had been introduced to the Chinese by the Portuguese. However, opium was being used in China only for medicinal purposes. Its trade had been banned by the Confucian rulers of China. They had also banned all foreign traders from trading in China, as they feared that the foreign traders might meddle in local politics and try to upturn power. The British then started an illegal trade of opium in China. They smuggled opium into China through their seaports and got it sold through some local agents. However, opium was not grown in England. It was grown in India. It was the poor peasants of Bengal who grew the opium that the British exported to China. However, the poor peasants of Bengal were far from happy to grow opium for the British. This was due to the constraints that they faced while growing opium. For example, the opium crop has to be grown on the best land available and provided good manure. The peasants earlier reserved the fertile land for cultivating pulses, but now they were forced to cultivate pulses on inferior land where harvests were poor and uncertain. Further, opium is a delicate plant that needs a lot of care and nurturing during cultivation. Therefore, the peasants found no time for their own crops. Moreover, most peasants had to pay high rents to the landlords for the land as they did not own any land. The British, therefore, appointed agents who advanced money to the rich landlords, who in turn gave the money to the peasants as loans. The peasants were now forced to grow only opium on the land and hand over the produce to the landlord, from where it ultimately reached the British. The British tried to make a win-win situation by paying low rates to the peasants and selling the opium to the Chinese at a higher rate, thus increasing their profit margins further. The peasants tried to resist this exploitation in many ways. Some of them refused to take advances and demanded higher rates. Some even refused to grow opium and started cultivating potatoes and sugarcane. There were others who sold off the opium produced by them at higher rates to traveling traders known as pikers. Very soon, the monopoly of the British over growing opium was also broken when states like Rajasthan, which were not under British rule, started growing opium and exporting it to China. The British not only exploited Indian opium peasants, but also spread smuggling of opium in China.